Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of 6 Feet Apart, our virtual programming here at Vermont Studio Center. Miss you. Today we've got my friend and roommate Sarah Audsley talking to author Emily Bernard. She's a Vermont author. Emily was here just a few months ago. Gosh, we're getting all of the hits. I remember her doing her first reading and being like, what? Words can do that? That was great. Take it away, Sarah.
Emily, congratulations on your recent awards. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us here at Vermont Studio Center. And I just wanted to open up with a quote that I remarked upon during your reading when you were here in February that I actually wrote down in my journal and really just kind of blew open endless possibilities for my own personal writing. And I reread it in your essay that's in the Yale Review called Stereopticon. And the quote that I would like to begin with, as maybe a jumping off point for our conversation, is, "But if you can't take liberties with your own life story, then really are you free?" And I'm just interested in your recent award winning and also the project that you're currently working on and what's most present in your mind right now.
Thank you, Sarah. As we're sitting here talking, I'm just overwhelmed by that really kind of innocent moment of that gathering at the VSC and how incredibly charming that space is, how magical it is for generations of writers, and how much dreaming goes on in that space, and imagining and planning and revelations. And it was such a perfect evening. I remember it. I will remember it always as one of the last great nights on Earth, as it went when Earth was an open book.
The before times.
Before times, and we were just artists there together, and that's what the space like yours enables. Just the flowing of ideas. So I'm so happy that line jumped from the page to the page of your journal, because it is an important line to me. And so thank you for having me here again. I mean, we didn't imagine this, but it feels exactly right.
No, it's really nice to reconnect with you, especially during this time, and to share a little bit of you and your work with our VSC community in a different way through our virtual programming.
I'm glad for that. And I think, I'm discovering, and I have the luxury to discover that, how we need art. I don't know, I mean, the rubble, and there's going to be more ruins await us, but we need art. And again, I feel like I've had the luxury of a lot of being employed, so I can kind of sit and think about things like art. But I think we all do, and I think all artists do at the end of the day. It's strange to say, but it's sort of I'm reminded every day, boy, it really is true. It wasn't something we were dreaming up to occupy our time when there was plenty, but in fact, it feels important, and I know it's life-saving for me. And that line, I thought about a lot. I thought about it definitely in relation to Zora Neale Hurston, and I wrote about it specifically in relation to her memoir. I guess it's more accurately described as a memoir, not a true autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. And Hurston, quite famously left out a lot of the facts of her biography. But over the years, my thinking has evolved around that, and I've, been parts of conversations about the book, and thought a lot about it, reread it several times. And I came to think about all the imaginative space that is left open if you're not committed to delivering the facts. And when I wrote that line, I thought about another book by Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And there's a famous scene that takes place in the courtroom. And, the whole book is structured around a conversation between two women. But at the moment when the main character has to literally speak for her life, testify to her experience so that she'll be exonerated, she's silent. Or rather, the conversation that happens in the courtroom is not represented for the reader. And been a lot of, generations of readers and fans, scholars, critics, wondering why in a book that's florid with language, why there's just this desert here, and there's nothing. And a lot of discussion, a lot of theories, but we are compelled to tell the truth in a courtroom. And certainly people of color, we have to, when we were pleading for our lives and seeking justice, we have no choice but to tell the truth. We enter courtrooms and know that the deck is stacked against us for reasons that are out of our control, and our only weapon is the truth. What does it mean to lie? For women, there's since the era of the slave narrative, Black women authors have not been able to represent themselves fully on the page. They've not been able to represent their desires fully, because
Yeah, and that's really interesting because I feel like in Black as the Body, I was wondering how you navigated withholding and also being very revealing, and your relationship with the first person autobiographical narrator. Is there a gap at all between the I in the book and the I that is Emily Bernard? Someone reading it feels like they know you, or some intimate details of your life, but in some ways what the restraint and withholding or forthcomingness is such an interesting craft choice for any writer, and especially a person of color.
You're right. And I think that's the real kernel of it. I think a lot about food analogies always come to mind, which is ironic because I don't cook, as we know. But but I watch a cook, my husband, and I think about how to experience a beautiful meal is to experience a mystery. You're not eating discrete ingredients. You're eating the magic, the concoction, and the double boil and trouble of the chef. And that's what makes us speechless at the end of a really astonishing meal, that the things we don't know, the mysteries. But the flavors have to blend smoothly, and the experience has to be, easy, for us to enjoy it. A complicated meal has to flow smoothly, has to slide easily down the tongue.
And dishes are in conversation with each other, which is
Yes.
how we manage the delay or the delivery of information within an essay or a narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think for those of us, I think you're absolutely right. I do feel like there's actually a very aggressive gap between the I on the page, the I, and the byline. And that has everything to do with how poorly our experiences as people of color are understood by a mainstream public that already has an idea about who we are. We already are existing within a narrative that we did not invent, but we must create and we must make stories. And in order to create meaningful stories, we have to be vulnerable. But, writers of color have always been facing that jury, so that the metaphor I think that Hurston creates in Their Eyes Watching God is really extends beyond the world she created. We're always on trial. We walk down the street, Black people, guilty as charged, and we only have to cite the recent unspeakable killing of the man who was jogging, and that was in Georgia. He was jogging down the street. He entered into a narrative that killed him. He entered into a fantasy on the part of people with guns with intention to kill him. So the balance to me is fascinating. How do we remain vulnerable? How do we remain safe? And for me, absolutely, the I is real. It's real, but it's also curated. It's raw at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in the reading experience. I want it to feel a little scary. I want it to feel a little. I want the reader to feel a little uncomfortable because that's, I think, how we can be open. If I give you a pat story and it's beginning, end, and I knew this was going to happen, I knew that was going to happen, then I think we both are unchanged by that experience. I have to be willing to go to different places. And I think that's how I encourage you to come along, right? By making myself vulnerable too. But it is, I think those best performances have to be curated. I read Nina Simone said at some point that the key to her success, or packing the rooms every night, she goes, something, I'm going to paraphrase, the audience comes to see me every night because they know I play very close to the edge. They're coming to see if I'm going to fall. So that awareness, I think the writer has to be aware of that too. I mean, it's how we save ourselves, those of us who write in that kind of register, by staying aware that the reader is expecting something from us, experiencing something, but you have to maintain, you can't give it all away.
Yeah, and what has really kind of messed with my head as a writer is, who is that reader? And in graduate school, I had the awakening of, oh, am I writing for a white audience, or am I writing for a fellow Korean American adoptee who grew up in rural Vermont? Or am I writing for everyone? And the choices that I make, and the lenses through which my work could be read, has all informed my own choices as a writer. And how have you managed that in your work?
I think that's an old question, right? That our communities have always had to struggle with. Who are we writing for? And who is the other, really? Your own biography that you just, that tiny 100-word biography, that's a complex story, and mine too, right? And yet, so how do you balance the universal and the very particular that we inhabit just as everyday people? But I think, I'll be honest with you though, I'm very bothered when I've been asked the question, when I've given readings, who are you writing for? And sometimes the question is delivered with a little bit of an edge, by Black readers who feel that I'm not telling a Black story to Black people.
That it's not Black enough, or
it's not Black enough,
right?
And that's an old trope. But the not Black enough story, and to be honest, it gets to me sometimes,
Yeah.
It gets to me. But we're preceded by people, like James Baldwin, who have the same critique lobby, and so it's an old conundrum. But I think if you get too caught up in who you're writing for, you just remain silent, and then days go by, and months and years, and you haven't written a damn thing, and that's unacceptable. So, I think we should ask these because they're interesting questions, and because they've always been asked, so they're important to some people. They're of course bigger than the question of what's happening on the page. Who do you serve?
Yeah.
Who's your tribe, and where are your loyalties? For us, right? Korean American, African American, what are our allegiances? We are products of this soil. We are. But we have other allegiances, and we belong to other stories and other countries and imaginaries. Do we get to decide that? Does a reading public decide it? I know that I can tell when a writer is conforming or trying to conform to a set of expectations. And that writing is boring. It does nothing for me. You can line my grave with it. But beyond that, I am not interested. It's not going to help me live, So yeah, and that's a human thing. You don't want to stand out. You don't want to be criticized. And I think certainly, that old, when I was first getting a whiff of these kinds of criticisms, an old friend of mine who happens to be, a gay Puerto Rican man from New Jersey, he said, Emily, it's not the first time somebody's questioned your Blackness, okay? I've been knowing you a long time. I said, thank you for that. It's true. It's just, in fact, the story of my life. And, I've learned firsthand the dangers of silence and how it doesn't help anyone, to sit in the corner and be a good girl. And I think we also have to interrogate who is asking the question. What is it that they want from you? What does your silence do for them? What are they afraid of? I mean, I had an encounter, I gave a reading, and a woman was actually quite hostile and accused me of writing for the white gaze. And, them's fighting words, but then I thought, and I had to ask myself, why is this bothering me so much? Because she's one person, there are plenty of people at the reading who were really pleased and got something positive out of the book. And of course, again, it triggers these old anxieties, I think, about authenticity. And I know that I can only tell the stories I can tell. I can't invent personas that, I can't invent experiences that I haven't had. And I know that my human experiences are meaningful to somebody. And so, I have faith in that. And I know that the books I've learned from come from, a variety of walks of, writers from a variety of walks of life, so I haven't just learned from Baldwin or Morrison. I've learned from so many writers, and there's no way you can get between me and, for instance, Yen Lee. I just was holding her book up recently, The Kindness of Solitude, and saying she has no idea how close we are.
Oh, yeah.
And how much her experience. All I can tell you is that there are a few writers, right? If she wrote a story every day, I wouldn't have to write. That's how deeply I connect with her, the worlds that she creates. And that's all I know.
So are you feeling more free now to work on this other project? I think when I read about it, it's called Unfinished Women, a proposed collection of 8 narrative nonfiction essays about Black women, artists, and public figures. I wondered if you wanted to talk more about transitioning into this project and what that means to tell other people's stories. And is it like almost like a deep honor, privilege, but also like an obligation in some ways too, to bring those complicated stories forward?
Absolutely. And yes, you captured it perfectly. Feels like an incredible honor, privilege, and obligation. And, even more so, I think, during this period, during this COVID nightmare. And as I ask myself, what can I do when we're having to disobey that very primal human need to come together? We have to somehow, we're saving each other by staying apart. It's something I have to almost repeat to myself because it's so counterintuitive that I can do my best work by staying in the house, and do the best for people I love by staying away from them. And I can't stay away from people. I find them very interesting. And I've been having these conversations with my aunt pretty regularly. In fact, I was thinking a lot about this book, and I was stuck, for a while. I think, it's just been my journey through this crisis has been the stops and starts. I think a lot of people are experiencing that. I was reading someone saying that it's just some weeks are okay, some are not. And within those weeks, there are days and hours you're just trying to manage it all. But I started to talk to my aunt because I'm worried about my aunts. They live in Mississippi, and I'm worried about if I'll ever see them again. I'm worried about the state of Mississippi. I'm worried about poor Black people in Mississippi. And I'm worried about what it's like to live there now. My aunts they're not young. They're not in tip-top, their health, health issues, as they get older and in a poor state.
It's very difficult to turn that off and to be creative during this time.
It's hard.
I've been having trouble writing myself, and I actually switched to making collage, visual poems.
Wow.
Which seems okay for now, but yeah. But the writing is still running in the background, I feel.
Always, I think that's right, and just like opening that door gently. But in the course of talking to my aunt about this, I was just checking in, but then I thought, like you, like, how can this dovetail with, some other things? And we started to tell me stories of her life that we've talked about before. And I realized how neatly they fit into the questions that I'm asking for this book. My aunt Julia, grew up in the segregated South and faced all of the structural limits in terms of opportunities. And she grew up in a house with a father who neglected her. Grandfather was a lifelong depressive. He had issues with alcohol addiction, like a lot of Black men of his generation in the South. Born before his time, born at a moment when, in a world that did not recognize his gifts, and in fact was hostile to his gifts, and faced lots of disappointments and a lot of frustration, and could not be a father to his children for that reason, and was a kind of, so my aunt had to grow up around that. She grew up around a lot of parental neglect and then discouragement. My grandmother, who suffered from her own demons, used to tell her things, you're dumb like me. So one scene that's always stuck with me, my aunt told me a story many years ago, sitting in a classroom in high school when it was time for standardized testing and just randomly circling in the little cells, just not even trying, because she's always told me, Emily, you have to expect things from kids. That's the biggest thing. I don't have my mother anymore. So, her wisdom is really that much more precious to me.
Yeah.
So we've been talking and I started to write these things. And I thought, this book is really about my aunt. It's about these women and trying to make a life in a world that had no place for them. How do you invent a new path? How do you invent the tools, if you don't have them?
And how do you even imagine a possibility when there has been no one before you?
Exactly.
That's astounding to me.
It is. It's just, I guess the older I get, the more I realize those things, and also just the mysteries, the pivotal experiences and moments, because even though my aunt, and she's such a kind of keen observer of her own life, and she tells me, she'll say, she'll tell me about those things, right, that were true about her life, but at the same time, there were these pivotal moments, interactions with people that helped her imagine something else. And so she went on to have a real career at the phone company Pacific Bell out in California when it still existed, as a programmer, which was not an easy feat, for a Black woman without a college degree and coming from that. But there was still a limit to that, and having these fascinating conversations about success and about what it takes to make your dreams come true, and if that's enough, what does it take? Sitting in our little boxes, in her in Mississippi and me in Vermont, and talking these things through. So it's helping me think a lot about this book. And now that finally we're getting a lot of mainstream press on the unsung, the non-essential workers that we knew always were essential workers. And now, and we'll see if this becomes something that actually where there's a real cultural revolution. But certainly I'm holding on to those stories because of what they're teaching me, of how to live. How are people doing this every day? How are the medical professionals doing it every day? What do they believe? How are they getting by just spiritually, beyond just how they keep moving? This book, I feel like, is a place for me to ask those questions. I'm looking at a lot of different kinds of stories, but essentially the question is the same. What makes living meaningful? What makes our lives, where does meaning lie? When you are facing down an obstacle, how do you work with that? And how do women do that and create joy and stories to pass down, really, is what I'm interested in. But yeah, so I'm like you, I have to, to pivot, constantly pivoting, constantly following the little tributaries. But I really love reading about people's lives and finding out how they did it. I find that endlessly interesting, and certainly women, working with the age-old constraints and the dictates. I love when a woman finally decides it's time to tell the truth. Those are the best moments. It's time to tell the truth about what I did and how I felt and how I lived. And that's what this book is about.
Oh, I'm really excited to read it. Yeah, it's very exciting to get a little preview and insight into what you're thinking and about in the foreground or the foundation for the future book that's forthcoming.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I mean, it's just taking my time. But I was talking to a friend of mine who is a curator of American poetry at the Beinecke Library at Yale, and we're talking about the archive and what a special place it is, to talk about making connections with other people, artists and writers and other public figures, leaving their materials behind and inviting generations of strangers to rifle through their papers, their letters and their diaries. It's very...
Whoa, no one's allowed to read my diaries. I have an agreement with a friend that if I die before her, she is tasked with burning my diaries.
Wow, that's a great agreement. I like that. That's interesting. I know of a woman who actually left her. I heard so many stories, and I know a woman now who's deciding to leave her diaries to her daughter
Oh,
in her, in her will. Actually, just reading Pearl Cleage, who wrote a book called Things I Should Have Told My Daughter, Lies, Lessons, and Love Affairs. And she begins the book by talking about inviting her daughter, saying, it's time you can read and the daughter had no interest because the daughter's a teenager at the time. I mean, I wish my mother had left behind. I mean, it's a very selfish wish,
do you know the story of Terry Tempest Williams?
No.
Okay, so
Oh, yes, but please tell it again. I do know the story.
Okay, so there's a nonfiction book called When Women Were Birds by Terry
Yes.
Tempest Williams. Her mom is on her deathbed and she goes into the hospital room and her daughter, and she says, Terry, I've left my journals for you. And she never knew her mom had written journals ever. And she's like, oh my God, this is like a gift that I'm receiving from my mother. And so her mother passes, and then finally she goes upstairs into the room where they're on like this long, huge bookshelf. And there's like stacks of them. And she takes them off, opens it, empty. Next one, opens it, empty. They are all empty. And it's like she lost her mother a second time because she thought she was going to get an insight into her mother that she had never had before through these journals. So it was like a second loss. I always think about that.
But yeah, I a friend of mine was talking about getting her will together and what to do about the property. She has some issues with her heart. And so, I don't know, we're in a pandemic. So she's sort of, all right, let me really get serious about this and think about property and these kinds of things. And I've been thinking about my children at home. I have 2 daughters, as you know, and every now and then I try to corner them and share like a little life lesson. They're entering high school. It's like, okay, so let's get ready for high school. What's high school about? What's the next step? And before the world went into lockdown, my husband and I actually did sit down. We plotted out our wills, which is hard. It's really, you have to really figure out a lot of grim scenarios as part of the process. So we're all thinking about mortality and experiencing it. And I've been thinking about that because there's so many little pearls, that my mother, I remember now, and I repeat them, to my children. They're, and they may be completely useless to my children, or maybe they'll pop up at 52 and say, hey, I should have listened to my mother. But if we all are lucky enough the world still exists, I've been thinking about that and that enormous gulf of time when I was not interested in my mother's life and her wisdom. It was staring me right in the face. And now on that side of it and thinking, all right, what are the things I want to drill into their head? How do you get it in there? What are the mistakes that I've made that I want to spare them? They don't have to make this mistake because I made it for them. What are the dreams? What do I see for them? And when I think about my mother's life story and how I tell it and how I just kind of continually kind of reacquaint myself with it by reading over her work. And now as I'm gearing up to, as you know, another project has exclusively to do with her and her marriage and these choices, and realizing how many ways there are to look at a life and how little, as you say, even a diary, even a first person account, we know how memory itself is unreliable, even about our own lives. So, I'm sort of passing down the pearls of wisdom to my children, but then of course I'm living something and they're watching and taking notes, and my daughter said to me, I was reading in bed and my daughter said, this is some weeks ago. She said, I think we're just, she's not supposed to be seeing me like this. Right? So they're supposed to be at school. So they're seeing this other thing. So I'm sitting in bed reading and she goes, how do you even have a career? I never see you working. I said, I'm working right now. I'm reading. It's part of my work. But, I've got my husband downstairs who's in his office going, bah, 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 from like literally 9 to 5. And I'm just like, la, 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 looking out the window and playing with my index cards and playing.
Like, this is research in action.
It is. I'm working. And I'm usually alone. So I don't have anyone looking at me, telling me I'm not working. But, they're watching. They're growing up and they're making decisions. I'll take this, I'll leave this behind. And so there are things I can't control, but I find that really interesting and thinking about these transitional moments. And Right. But I love looking at people's private stuff. But I love I love also what things people don't say, you know, and I love the way people tell the stories of their own lives. And I guess that's why I'm not a reporter, because, you know, I love the gaps, you know, I love the things people don't say. I love the silences and being quiet in someone else's silence, and honoring and the way they need to tell a particular kind of story. I think that that's really a beautiful thing, you know, and that's what an archive does. Of course, it gives you a cultivated story of a person's life, you know, and of course you're leaving those effects behind me, even in a diary, you know, as you're already imagining, right? And I think that, isn't it true maybe to think freely, you know, when we were kids, I don't know, but certainly when I was 12, 13, I wasn't thinking about pulling any shades down or having anyone looking. And now I think about that with my kids, like, what do I want them to know about my inner life? But what will be helpful to them, you know, and what won't be helpful, you know?
I feel like you're such a people person in so many ways, but also like what you just said is honoring that everyone has their own interior life, and you might not be privy to it all, which is the fascinating part of studying human beings.
Yeah, it really is. And I think also, you know, I think that's a great thing about living, is that you really can discover new things about yourself and other people all the time if you just pay attention. And that's such a huge part of conversation, is listening. You know, that's one thing I do miss, is just sort of being able to sit in silence and be with people. That's a great, I'll never take that for granted again. Just a simple pleasure of being able to move easily in the world. And I mean, I don't know if we'll have that again, but that's, I think, a lot of the root of my own creative life, is just wanting to be with people. But also I like to watch, I like to observe, I like to, you know, be in intimate contact, but also that space. And I think the earlier discussion we were having about the distance between the eye on the page and the eye in the byline, you know, there's that wonderful silence that's rich and mysterious and is always changing and dangerous, and the acknowledgement that we can never fully, you know, represent ourselves. I mean, think about, you know, even doing some of these Zoom things, and, you know, someone freezes and it can just really freak you out. But you realize, like, when you're frozen for them, they're not necessarily frozen for you. And that's the reality of human experience. You know, that's actually really what it is. We're actually never quite in sync. Someone's talking to you, you're thinking about it, takes you down a little path, and then you rejoin, and it's like we're together, but we're always in our separate spheres, you know. But I think that for me, closing that gap will be a lifelong kind of quest. Like, I'm really interested in that line between self and other, and really
what can create connection, and the reason maybe why I am realizing now I'm in the game is great writing, and creating that space or the gap between the reader and the writer. And I really appreciate what you do in your work, and I'm really grateful to be having this conversation with you, and that we cross paths at Vermont Studio Center.
too. I'm so happy about that. It's a great gift of the before times. Let's pledge to just keep at it, and we'll keep meeting up again in this life.
She put so much thought into that. Wow, thanks, Sarah. And Emily. Thank you, Emily. Thanks for your time. That was generous. I'm not sure if Kristen's been up to anything these days, but let's check in with her real quick.
I'm just gonna get us to shore. Yeah, I got this. Don't worry, I got this.
Just what I expected. So good to see you, and I'll see you again next week. Hope you're doing great. Bye.